Hi, I'm a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'll be talking about public transit access and income segregation within cities. So public transit can disproportionately improve mobility for the urban poor, and it has often been considered a means of targeting welfare towards the poor in cities. But mass transit services tend to be sparsely connected within cities. So when rich and poor households differ in their travel mode choices, that also means they differ in their preference for transit accessible neighborhoods. As a result, the transit network can end up concentrating urban poverty in low-income neighborhoods. So a series of recent case studies of rail transit expansions have found that transit can often be a driver of income segregation and potentially lead to worse access to desirable urban amenities like good schools, despite the improved travel mobility for the urban poor. So in this paper, I'm going to introduce a general equilibrium model of travel mode and residential location choices in order to characterize when transit improvements increase as opposed to decrease income segregation. I'll characterize where to locate these transit improvements in order to minimize segregation. And then, of course, transit is typically intended to tackle the negative externalities of driving, like road congestion or carbon emission. So I'm gonna show how these segregation minimizing policies compare to policies that might be most efficient at increasing transit ridership. And I'm going to show that transit improvements that are most effective at doing so are also likely to exacerbate income segregation. So policymakers often have to trade off the more equitable outcome for the more efficient one. So a lot of what I'm going to present is going to be driven by the fact that high and low income households in cities have very different preferences for transit. So in US cities, lower income households are a lot more likely to ride buses than higher income households. Whereas transit ridership among railways and subways are a lot higher among higher income households. And of course, transit fares are usually the same, so there is no reason to think that rail transit is not affordable, but transit neighborhoods often tend to be pricier, and they tend to capitalize the greater travel access you get from living close to transit. And as it often happens, rail transit neighborhoods tend to be more affordable to higher income households. So if you look at transit ridership within neighborhoods in New York City, for example, you see close to subways and rail transit, rich and poor are equally likely to ride transit. But as you move further away, lower income households are more likely to ride the transit than higher income households. So with these observations in mind, and without further ado, let me jump into kind of setting up this model. Consider a very simplified stylized city with 2 residential neighborhoods, 2 modes of travel, a fixed population of rich and poor households. Each household takes a fixed set of trips. They can be to jobs, groceries, etc. These trips within the city, the travel times on these trips vary with the neighborhood and mode choice of the households. We're going to assume that driving is always costlier than riding the transit. And besides taking these trips, households otherwise occupy identical housing spaces. They pay rents that are endogenously determined to make sure that the overall housing demand in each neighborhood matches the fixed housing supply. So to decide how to travel on each trip, households are minimizing households are going to choose the mode of travel that minimizes the monetary cost of travel, as well as the opportunity cost of the time they spend traveling. So this is going to be increasing with income. This is the time you spend traveling instead of working. Because the opportunity cost of time is increasing with income, that also means higher income households are more likely to ride the faster mode of travel. So that means when transit is a slower mode of travel, transit ridership is going to be decreasing with income. As transit gets faster, transit ridership starts to increase with income. Finally, households choose the residential neighborhood to live in to maximize their net disposable income, net of all of these housing and travel costs, given their travel mode choices, given the housing prices that make sure kind of housing markets are in equilibrium, and whatever idiosyncratic preferences they may have for one neighborhood over the other. So if we now improve travel times by transit from one of the neighborhoods, we make the neighborhood more attractive for everyone, but more so to households who are frequent transit riders. So the households who have the greatest travel cost savings on transit in the other neighborhood are the ones who are more likely to move in. They're willing to pay higher housing prices to move into this neighborhood. Higher housing prices are going to drive out marginal households in neighborhood 1 who have a relatively lower willingness to pay for transit. So when transit is slow relative to driving, as we saw, transit ridership is primarily low income. That means neighborhood 1 attracts more low income households. Of course, when transit is fast and transit ridership is primarily high income, neighborhood 1 attracts more high income households. We see this sort of dynamics in US cities as well. Between 2000 and 2010, neighborhoods where transit ridership have gone down in cities with more bus transit ridership have also seen incomes go down. On the other hand, in cities where transit ridership is primarily by rail, it's a more of a U-shaped relationship. So neighborhoods where transit ridership has gone down a lot, you see incomes have gone up, but so has neighborhoods where transit ridership has gone up. So what does this mean for income segregation? Well, improving transit increases income segregation when you either improve high-speed transit in high-income neighborhoods or low-speed transit in low-income neighborhoods, thereby making high-income neighborhoods even richer, or poor neighborhoods even poorer. Or kind of more generally, we can say to minimize segregation, a planner may want to expand low-speed transit, like shared buses, in high-income neighborhoods, or high-speed transit in low-income neighborhoods. Now, of course, planners care about segregation, but they also care about kind of being cost-effective, tackling congestion. They care about being able to attract new transit ridership with the transit improvements. I show that transit ridership is maximized by improving transit access from the neighborhood with higher aggregate incomes. These are the neighborhoods where there are more drivers who are willing to switch to transit in response to faster transit. As we saw earlier, higher income drivers have a higher opportunity cost of time. They're willing to pay more to reside in neighborhoods where travel is getting faster. So these are the marginal transit riders. Of course, now if this is not unusual in a lot of cities, a lot of transit is concentrated in central, more income-dense neighborhoods. But that also means when you target these central income-dense neighborhoods, you end up, of course, when transit is slow, you decrease segregation because you make these income-dense neighborhoods. You disperse these income-dense neighborhoods more. Lower-income households can displace some more higher-income households. But when transit is fast, you make these income dense neighborhoods even more higher income. So for high-speed transit planners have to trade off this, their preference for lower segregation and higher ridership. So my paper highlights this tension between these two potentially desirable social outcomes of public transit expansions. Transit planners have an incentive to often forego equity for efficiency. Of course, it doesn't mean they always do that. In the paper, I show that in US cities in the past, historically, there have been a tendency to focus transit more in high income dense neighborhoods. But that's starting to change. More so between 2000 and 2010, you see that rail transit expansions have been more in lower income neighborhoods, and bus transit expansions have started to be more in higher income neighborhoods. Now, of course, everything I've presented is a very stylized model with lots of simplified assumptions. In the paper, I show that these modeling choices are robust to more realistic generalizations as well, and more sophisticated modeling. You can have income sorting on other dimensions, or more complicated travel networks. Also, another thing this paper doesn't do is it doesn't account for welfare. Segregation is important, but we don't understand. There are still lots of studies on what are the real costs of these income segregation, what are the true costs of improving high versus low speed transit, and even if sometimes gentrifying poorer neighborhoods decreases income segregation, what are the actual costs of displacing poor and low income households from their original location choices. So basically, this paper hopefully lays the theoretical foundation for further research. Yeah, so thanks, and you can find this paper and me at my website.